share screen, right, Brant?
Yeah. Why don't you try that right now?
Okay.
Should be co-host.
Yeah, they're working?
Yep.
Okay, and then I can do this. Dun, 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 dun. How does that look?
Yes, perfect.
You want me to just keep it this way?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
All right. So my recording will show your face at the top and like in a ribbon, and then your presentation at the bottom.
Great.
All right, ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. 1, 2, 3, recording.
Are we ready to go?
He'll let the participants in.
Sorry, it's all you.
I can't see that there are any participants yet. Is that just on my side?
If there are folks in the lobby, you need to admit them.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess we'll get started. So, good morning. My name is Sawyer Judge. I'll be today presenting about being a student in wargame design, what that's like, and I'll also be talking about the design process behind the wargame that I started with a student team at Georgetown University under the direction of Sebastian Bay, and that game is called Heroes Rising: Three Kingdoms. I'd like to say before I introduce myself that I am an employee of CNA and a Georgetown student, but everything in this presentation is my own views. It doesn't represent any of the organizations I'm affiliated with. So Heroes Rising: Three Kingdoms is an educational operational game that strives to engage players in history at the operational level. It's born in a classroom, but for me, it also really represents what it's like to be an aspiring wargame designer, what it means to go from being a student to actually someone who is a part of the field. And this, to me, was sort of a first step in me starting my career as a wargamer. So I wanted to sort of talk about the design process, but what it also means for young students who are trying to gain confidence in the field. So I'm going to start by introducing myself, and then I pretty much have broken this presentation into 3 chunks. About the game itself, how it's played, how it works. Second, about the design process that led up to it. And finally, a brief argument for why I think teaching wargame design is important and why it is okay to teach wargame design in the classroom. So who am I? As I said, I'm an associate research analyst at the Center for Naval Analysis. I'm also an amateur wargame designer, partly because of this course and this experience, but also because of a personal passion and a pursuit of studying wargame design. I also wrote my master thesis at Georgetown University on the Wargaming Guild, how the nature of a discipline impacts its craft and whether it matters. I've gotten 2 degrees from Georgetown University in a 5-year program. I just graduated with my master's in security studies this past May. And this game has had quite a journey so far. It was prototyped in the Basics of Wargaming class at Georgetown University. Sebastian Bay was my professor, and he'll be talking at 11 about what that's like to be a professor teaching wargaming. So if you attend both, you're going to get sort of both views of this experience. The SSP at Georgetown gave me a scholarship to reproduce this game professionally, so you're going to see kind of a final product in this presentation. And I had the honor of presenting it at the Krulak Center at William Core University as well. Okay, so how do you play this massive operational educational game? So the project's goal from the start, and I think this is really important because something I learned right up front is that you have to have a good research question going into wargame design. The project's goal was sort of to tackle at the strategic, operational, and tactical level the decade from 210 to 220 CE in the Three Kingdoms period of ancient China, and we wanted students to understand what made it difficult for warlords Cao Cao, Liu Bei, and Sun Quan to unite China quickly in this critical decade. When we were looking at the history, we had a lot of what-if questions about why it was difficult, and we wanted students to really tangibly interact with those challenges and try to overcome them. So at the strategic level, that looks like choosing between conquest and consolidating. Should you launch a massive campaign to try to unite all of China, or is it better to consolidate your power and then build out slowly? The operational level, which is really the main focus of the game. You're considering external forces and internal realities, so nature effects, but also managing your resources. It was not a small economy game, but we wanted to impose just enough resource decisions to make it count. And then, of course, the tactical level. Um, this was something that was really baked into the mechanics of the game, so people didn't have to make quite so many, it wasn't like a miniatures game where you're really moving individual units, but we baked tactics into the combat adjudication system, so students could learn how to employ their forces, but face sort of advantages and disadvantages for the unit types that they put forward in combat. The 3 players of the game were the 3 traditional warlords of this period, and we were really excited to have a 3-player game that allowed students to choose their kingdom and really sort of get into the legend of their character. So we did a lot to sort of build out the fluff in this area. Cao with the largest army, strong cavalry, Hubei with mountains for defense, sort of a tendency to consolidate for that reason, and Sun Quan, who had an advantage on the provinces near rivers, where he could, wield his massive navy. And we tried to represent these advantages as well in the game design. So what do you need to do to win this game? We ended up deciding that there needed to be 2 different paths to victory, and this was sort of a decision that was made through a lot of play testing, because originally we were like, oh, well, we should, see, who can conquer all of China, but it turns out that conquering China is really, really very difficult. So option 1 is to declare your kingdom, quote unquote, which is to build a certain amount of legend power, something we call hero points, in addition to controlling all 50 strongholds of China, which is considered conquering China. And then the second option is to declare your kingdom. Again, you have to have a certain amount of power, reputation, hero points, but then you have to complete 3 levels of mission objectives. And mission objectives sort of were something that my team and I decided would be a loose representation of being enough of a leader, enough of a hero, enough of the full story, completing that character, that general's personal objectives for their kingdom to represent something like a victory, even if China was not in fact united. Because in the time period that we picked in this game, China was not united by the end of it. So this was sort of the more realistic option, but we wanted the game to give players the opportunity to conquer China if they could. Okay, so the map, movement, the turn taxonomy. The map, and you've seen a couple pictures of it so far, but I'll have a better picture later, ended up being massive because we wanted to employ a node system that allowed players to really move their players along 16 units. If you had a Lu is the Chinese word for the divisions we were using, of all cavalry because you can move faster, and 8 nodes if you have any other rank of archers, of cavalry, of generals, of infantry. And so we wanted this map. It's sort of, if any of you have played Friedrich, it sort of took after that. We also have a province system. It ended up being a very complicated map, but was probably our most rewarding design challenge. So in terms of the turn taxonomy, the first step is to collect gold. We wanted to really keep the resource part of this at a minimum. Step 2 is the player turn, which you can see under basic taxonomy has been pulled out here into buy things, move your players, fight if fighting is initiated, and then finally maneuver with whatever movement points you have left. After all 3 players have completed that, then you move to step 3 for everyone. An external event card is drawn that affects the entire board, and then finally cleanup. People take stock, move their movement points back to their origins, and the season changes, and we go to the next turn. That's the general turn taxonomy. Here's a better picture of the map, and honestly, images are better than me trying to explain what it looks like. This was a 3-foot by 4-foot massive map of China, and I can't take full credit for the graphics. It was a student project, so we did take a lot of art from Total War 3 Kingdoms, the online game for the same period. This map was based on their art, but we overlaid a node system. You can also see we have capitals, and in the bottom right corner, you can see we have something that's called a combat ring. We also have different color nodes, and that's why I've put a close-up on the right. The different color nodes represent different types of terrain, and this is where the tactics are involved in this game. Depending on where battle is initiated, certain units have certain advantages. Archers have more advantages in the mountains, cavalry have more advantages on the plains, and infantry have more advantage in the forest and high. And this is based on just very basic tactical understanding. You can also see that we have gray squares, and those are places where you can build strongholds. And in this game, you own one of the different colored provinces by building a stronghold on it and then protecting it. And just like in Monopoly or something, when you build a stronghold, you get a province card. And the province card determines your resources. Every time that resources come around, you collect taxes from your peasants. You get a certain amount of gold for all of the different provinces you own. And some provinces, say the ones with capitals, are worth more than others. So that's the basic lay of the land. You can also see a hero point tracker on the very bottom, all of those little numbers in the bottom of the map. And that's where the legend or hero points are accumulated. And those, I'll talk about those a little bit more, but you can kind of see on the map how reaching certain levels of points unlocks certain advantages. So if you get to be this massive hero, then there's more things that you can do. Okay, so these are the things that you can buy in the first initial stage of the player turn. You can buy armies, infantry, cavalry, archers. You can buy strongholds. We encourage our players, or well, really, you should for this game, buy your strongholds up front in your buy turn, so that when you conquer a place, you actually have the resources to build a fortress and put a garrison force there, was our understanding of buying a stronghold. You also have your generals. You start out the game with a hero, which is the really big meeple there, and 2 additional generals. But after you gain a certain amount of hero points, you have the option to buy another general, because generals can die in this game and you might want to buy a new one, or you might want to try to employ as many generals as you can if it's worth the resources. And finally, we have stratagems. And those are based directly on the sort of the romantic epics surrounding the Three Kingdoms period. We pulled directly from the literature to have these like special advantage cards. So if you buy a stratagem, you can employ them in certain situations indicated on the cards, combat, defense, that allow you to sort of get into the mood and the story and the legend of this game. Other features, our combat adjudication system is very much tied up in the combat ring, which is on the far right side of this slide. Combat essentially works by putting your 3 lu is the term for one of these military units, about 500 people, forward. And then the defender gets to put forward 2. And you roll dice, and your 2 highest die defeat the 2 lowest die. And 1 unit dies, you have the option to put another forward, or you have the option to. And there are certain advantages for defenders. Defenders win ties, for example, but also advantages based on stratagems you play and the terrain that you're on. We also have Peasant Unrest, which is tied up in our external event cards. The other image on this slide, you can see event cards for spring, summer, winter, and autumn. Each time that all 3 players go comprises a season, bookmarked at the end by an external event card. Things like famine or political unrest happen randomly and can affect any number of provinces indicated on the card. Those things can force players to lose resources, or their provinces can become populated by peasants. And they have to go and defeat those peasants in combat if they don't want to lose all of their ability to tax that province or ownership of the province. Peasants can burn down strongholds. Peasants can be pretty pesky. This mechanic was actually based on the epidemic population system in the board game Pandemic. And then we also encourage in the game informal alliances and betrayal, which is representative of the time. Finally, I have some images of sort of the final product of the game, what it looks like in the box, our rule book, all of the different components. We have these lovely player screens that you can kind of see in the bottom left image that serve as sort of to protect your intelligence, to protect how many units you've assigned to each of your armies. And we also have in the bottom right these lovely abacuses, that we created to track your movement points. And they have stickers on the side for the general that you've assigned your forces to, and you can say, oh gosh, like we've moved 8 turns to get to the node that I wanted to go, so that at the end of your turn, when you have the chance to maneuver, you can see how many movement points you have left to do that if you so So that was sort of the basic overview of the game itself, and I can go into detail during the Q&A if you have any specific questions on how it works. I know I moved through that very fast, but learning to design the game is really what I wanted to talk about today. And on this slide, you can see my student colleagues, Evan and Hannah, working really hard. We spent a lot of long hours just bent over a table, drawing on paper, printout maps, trying to get the game. So the first part I would say, and Sebastian will talk about this in his next presentation after mine today, but the first basic part of learning to design as a student with no experience ever designing a game before was digging into the literature. And I had, I guess, the advantage of writing my master's thesis on the theoretical side of wargaming at the same time as designing this game. So I was looking at my personal literature that was relevant to my thesis topic, which will come up later, but also the literature that was relevant to the curriculum of the course. And these, I think, are sort of the founding books for my thinking about wargame design, and I'm sure for many other people. You know, Peter Perlo's The Art of Wargame Design, Simulating War, Zones of Control, and these were just really great places to start when learning to understand wargaming. Our basic process was broken down into 4 parts, starting with the research question, developing a scenario, presenting the initial design, getting feedback, and then finally ending in the demo of the game. But most of the work happens in these little subsections of these parts. Develop the research question, and then there's this huge amount of time of just historical research, trying to understand everything about the time period so that you can scope and scale the project, but also so you can draw upon your knowledge to create the chrome and fluff that makes the game so exciting. The scenario, we developed the scenario, and then we had to do mechanical research, design thinking, prototyping, all of these different ways of actually putting the game together, which I think was really the fun and exciting part. The initial design is sort of the moment where you hold your breath and you put it forward towards a group of your peers and colleagues and go tear it apart, critique it for me. Play testing, asking people questions. What's confusing about this? How can this get better? And then finally just revising, and ending up with something like a final slide. There it is. So I wanted to just sort of, I took these pictures of the whiteboards that we had while we were designing, and I put these up here because I think that what sticks out in my mind for my first time going through designing a game was just the amount of time having a whiteboard and just writing, throwing spaghetti at the wall, seeing what would stick, thinking out a process with other people. I think wargame design is best when it's collaborative because you really get big, bold ideas and you can challenge your own personal tendencies and assumptions. If I had designed this game by myself, without someone on the other side of the whiteboard with another marker and another color, erasing my things, writing things, challenging me, it would have ended up being a very different looking game. So I wanted to put some of our brainstorming process here. And this slide, this compilation of pictures, is just evidence to the fact that there was a lot of play testing done. There was a lot of taping all these different pieces of printer paper together, bribing people with Oreos and meat thins to come out and please play this game, putting everything out, and then just asking people who had no familiarity with wargame design at all, hey, is this fun? What about this doesn't make sense to you? And honestly, my peers and my roommates who weren't even interested in security studies at all had some of the best ideas because they were coming in at it with such fresh eyes. And I think that was one of the big takeaways for me in this time process. We also wrote a design journal, which was helpful for me and my colleagues to keep track of the decisions that we made. And I've highlighted here 4 of the things that changed the most over time. How to do combat, we had a lot of debate about that. What the turn taxonomy would look like changed a couple of times. Also, ironing out the mission objectives that we wanted players to complete in order to win, and deciding what it really meant to conquer China. The map originally had 80 provinces, and that was daunting. So we reduced it to 50, and then in the end, we decided maybe it would be better to have a victory condition where you only have to control 25 of the 50. Because if you conquered half of China, maybe that's a sign that you're probably close to conquering the rest. In the end, I think that there were 4 main pathologies that sort of plagued us. And I think that these are common, I would say, for most people who try to design a game. You have to make critical decisions that affect how big your game is going to be, because if you really love the time period and the history, I think you want to include everything, but then it becomes a problem of scale. Detail and abstraction. That's sort of a similar thing to right-sizing the game. How much do you want to go into all the fascinating parts of the subject matter, and when is it better to simplify? Playability versus academic value. That was something perhaps very specific to designing a game in a course, because we felt that we needed to emphasize the academic side of the game, have it be something that can teach people, but we also didn't want this game to become a simulation. We wanted it to be liberated from the constraints of history enough to let players get into the role and feel the challenges of being a warlord in ancient China, but also to see history play out perhaps different than it actually did. And then finally, challenge versus achievability. You want a game to be challenging enough to be fun, but you don't want it to be too hard so as it's frustrating. And I think that that was probably the hardest thing to get down, because it's just a matter of playtesting over and over to see how people react and what they're willing to do when they play. And finally, time permitting, I would like to make an argument for why I think teaching wargame design is so important. And a lot of the research that I'm going to go into here is rooted in my thesis, so I will talk about that briefly. But I think that there's a common misunderstanding that the only way to learn wargame design is by doing. And I think that that's a critical part of it, but anything about my experience designing this game would tell me that there is value in starting in an academic setting, because you get certain advantages there that are helpful for the specific nature of the wargaming community. This is why I want to start with the Wargaming Guild, and I have here just an image of some medieval guild signage. But the whole point of this slide is to say that I really do firmly believe, and I think my research has supported this, that the wargaming community does operate very much like a medieval guild. Of course, we can all read, and there's some improvements on medieval times, but we operate in a sense that there are sort of masters of design that have been doing this, and they know what a war game looks like because they built one and they say that that's what it looks like. And us young people are lucky if we get chosen to be sort of an apprentice and learn how to design under their guidance by doing over time. But it hasn't really been until, I would say, recent years that we started to see a resurgence of actually trying to teach wargame design in the schools. And I think that that's probably a response to people saying, hey, this is something that is a really prominent industry, and there's a lot of really exciting things about design. How do we get more people into this? There's got to be more streamlined on-ramp. So my thesis wanted to take this wargaming guild, and it wanted to pinpoint the issues that the guild had in getting more people. And something that I sort of discovered was that the wargaming community hadn't quite decided firmly whether or not wargames were a science or an art. And so I did a lot of research on the artistic research community, which is really prevalent in Europe. And I pulled out some different traits that sort of set science and art academic disciplines apart. And I did a cross-examination of the wargaming community, and I was able to determine through design standards of practices and evaluation standards of practices where wargaming design fell on the scale of art and science disciplines. And through this process, I found that in almost all cases, wargaming is an art. And that's relevant to the conversation of how we educate young wargamers, because teaching people something that's an art form is very different than teaching something that's a science. In this critical time where we're seeing sort of an inverted labor triangle for the wargaming field, I think that talking about this question is really relevant right now, and young people have a lot to offer. There's a diversity of thought and just flat out diversity that's needed in the field, and young people can sort of be an easy way to tackle that. And I think that the expansion of the field and the solidification of this field as an art discipline rests on the shoulders of new game designers coming up through the ranks, and they can help in that process. But there are a couple barriers to entry. that my thesis identified, and I think a lot of other people have identified in articles, if there aren't prevalent academic on-ramps, that becomes an issue for people trying to figure out how to get into wargaming or to find out that wargaming exists at all. A lot of my peers, when I try to explain what I do, are very confused, but then they express an interest and they're like, oh, if only I had known about that. That's amazing that you get to study that for a living. That's fantastic. I think that we're sorely missing out if wargaming isn't at the forefront of academic institutions. But also the consolidation of experience and workload in accomplished community members. What I mean by that is that you have these people who are so excellent at wargame design, but their workload is massive. They're incredibly busy trying to create these wargames, and it's hard to find time for mentorship in this guild-like, apprentice-like system if you have so much going on. And I think teaching wargame in the classroom can sort of take that burden off of already working wargame designers. But I would be remiss if I said that this is, a huge issue and nothing's being done about it. There are a lot of fantastic programs for educating young designers already, and I've put a couple of examples here, but there are more than this. And War on the Rocks is chock full of fantastic articles about the value of educating young designers, so I won't, steal their breath, but I just wanted to put out some of my favorite programs on that slide. And finally, before we get to Q&A, what do I think we should do about this? I think that understanding that wargaming is an art means that we can think about teaching wargame design as we would think about teaching any sort of art form. That means teaching the theoretical side. It also means studio hours. It means practice. Anything that you could imagine an art student doing could be something that a wargame design student could be doing. And I've highlighted here 4 specific solutions I wanted to talk about. One is to encourage and expand the apprenticeship model. I don't think that all wargame teaching should be converted to the classroom. I think that there's value in apprenticeship, and I think that if you look at the artistic research community, you'll see that some of the best artists, designers, come from situations where they had a specific mentor who really encouraged them to develop their own style. One-on-one works well, but I also think that we could have an apprenticeship model where there are more collaborative spaces, workshops, things where you bring people of multiple ages and backgrounds together to engage in that design process together, which is why I think, circling back to the idea of, everyone crowd around the whiteboard with their different colored markers and make something happen is so important. I also would say that encouraging wargame study through commercial gameplay is important, and I think this virtual conference is absolutely evidence of that. Just having people play games is one of the best ways to learn. I think that my favorite part of the design process was the mechanical research, because I love playing board games, and I loved going to my shelf and pulling up games and being like, oh, I wonder if we could steal that fantastic mechanic from Pandemic to represent peasants. Why not? If it works, it works. It's also a very social element, and I think that creating any sort of craft or art, while it's traditional to think about, the brooding artist whose work is their own and they do it alone, I think that wargaming has a critical departure from traditional art forms in that I think it is often benefited by the collaborative artistic experience. Looking for future wargamers in new sources. All kinds of skills can translate to wargame design. One of the best changes we made to our game came from my roommate, who's a ER nurse at Children's National. And she was looking at it from a perspective of, she's looking at the game from a perspective of making decisions under stress because of her job. And she doesn't want to go into wargame design, but it definitely got me to thinking after one long night playtest, there could be really interesting ideas for these games in all kinds of fields and people everywhere, which is why I think getting more young people interested and finding out about conferences like this is a great way to get more people into the field. And finally, building out the formal academic discipline. And this is sort of a soapbox issue for me because this is what my thesis is on. But currently for the field, other than going to some platforms like the Armchair Dragoons blog, PAX Sims, War on the Rocks, where do we find the grand consolidation of wargaming literature? how do we formalize the very informal networks that are sort of held together? Wargaming is a small community, and I don't know that there's any reason why we couldn't formalize it in such a way that we built the strength and reputation of the community on the whole. And I think that that would encourage the validity of the field and therefore also encourage more people to go into it. And I think that academic programs at institutions like Georgetown, like the military academies, war colleges, I think that those are great places to start for increasing the validity of the field. So again, I just want to thank everyone who came for attending, and I will stay on the line for questions and answers.
Hey Sawyer, it's Sebastian here. We have we have a couple questions from the YouTube live stream and some in the chat box. We'll give the first one to Regimental Commander as our host to be the first question. Is, of the playtesters you mentioned, some had no wargaming experience or very little. What, if any, differences in feedback did you see from folks with or without wargaming experience? We'll start with that first question.
Yeah, I think that is so true and was so valuable. The first playtest that we did was with colleagues from my own academic program in security studies. And they came at the approach from, I don't want to say that they were all sort of, jockeying their own military experience, because that wasn't it, but there's a tendency to fall back on your own academic discipline, and so their questions and their critiques of the game were more from a military history standpoint. They were concerned about how tactics were represented and operations. And then the second time was just with some friends, and I was really hoping that the focus of that playtest would be to see if the game was fun and easy to understand, if the rule book made sense. And I actually think that playtest was more valuable than playtesting with subject matter experts, as I would call the first playtest, because it helped simplify the game. Because we focused on what was easy, and there wasn't as much already existing background knowledge, which would have biased how easy the game was to understand. And I think even if you want people with experience on the subject to play the game, it's more advantageous to the design process itself to start with something that's simple, that's easy to understand, that translates to anyone, because then people who come at it later with even more experience, I think, will not have to spend as much headspace just understanding the mechanics of how the game works, and can focus on relating it to their vast subject matter expertise. So yeah, thank you for that question.
So Sawyer, another follow-up on playtesting is, what suggestions were like big changes they offered for your design, and what suggestions were sort of duds that didn't quite work out?
Yeah, well, I know I skimmed over this slide, but let me go back to, and this is also just from my own memory, the design journal, because I put here these 4 big changes, and the design journal was an ongoing process where we just kept track of our decisions and when they were made. But a lot of material was added to this design journal that we turned in at the end of the course after those playtests, because that is where the most holes were poked. I think the biggest thing that changed after the playtests would be the mission objectives had to get altered quite a bit, because our players weren't understanding the point of them. And so we spent a lot of time trying to say, oh, well, the first set of mission objectives was supposed to sort of accomplish, it was supposed to kind of set a sort of goals where we would see everyone consolidate their forces, and then the second set of mission objectives was supposed to do this other thing. And we just had a really great dialogue about that. But also, I think area control, that was something that changed. Originally, we said we want all of the, if you remember the gray squares on the map, within each province, there are like 3 or 4 of those different squares. And originally we said, you have to occupy all of those squares in order to own a province. It slowed the game down tremendously, and our players expressed a lot of frustration, and said, I don't really understand the point of that when I could just build one and move on, and then it's on me to protect that province, but I don't feel like I need to own the whole thing. Something else that we changed was the retreat mechanic. We wanted retreat to be something that was allowed after combat began, but originally we wanted retreat to be a factor of movement points. So if you remember the abacus, And if you have a mixed unit that has more than just cavalry, you can only move 8 nodes. And so we wanted people to have to think about, oh, well, I only want to move this far because I want to maintain at least 3 nodes worth of retreat in case I get into conflict in the next turn. But it was so complicated for players to remember, even with the abacus, how many points, and it just clouded the decision space. So after some play tests, we scratched that and we said you get to retreat, and retreat is always 4 nodes, and just that's that. And that was one of those abstraction versus complexity decisions that we had to make that was really decided for us because of play testing.
So, along those lines, can you explain how you made the abacuses and what they were functioned for? Because I know there's a great story behind that.
There is a great story behind the abacuses. So they're actually picture frames, and let me go to a picture of them. I guess I really was excited about sort of the chrome and fluff aspect of wargame design a little bit. You can see the abacus on the bottom right there. And I knew that we were sort of stealing on this node-based movement system. And it would be easy to just say, you move 8 if you're this kind of unit, you move 16 if you're this kind of movement. But because we wanted people to be able to also maneuver, and so there was some sort of, if I move 7, then I can move 1 unit later and maneuver, and we wanted to help people keep track of that. We went through a couple different iterations of trying to think about how they could track that in a place that wasn't their brain, so that they could remove that from all of the decisions in their head. And at first we started with whiteboards, or like little, plastic stickers and markers, and it just became, it was hard to clean, it was messy, it wasn't professional looking. And so I was thinking about ancient China, and I was like, gosh, wouldn't it be great if we could do an abacus? But of course, abacuses, or abaci, I'm still not quite sure which the plural is, don't come with exactly 5 rows and 16 beads on each row. So I made them from scratch, just, a trip from Michael's, got some picture frames, pushed all the glass out, got some metal rods and some wooden beads. And the first iteration of the abaci were a lot more difficult because I got wooden dowels instead of metal rods. And so the beads were the holes on the beads were too small. And so there was one night where I literally, with sandpaper over a trash can, just trying to make the wooden dowels smaller to go through the beads, and all of the hot glue burns, and it was a really fun, creative process. But the final product with the metal rods was a lot better. The beads moved smoothly, and it was, I guess, sort of exciting to open the box for players and then to pull out these massive, sizable abaci, and to have it sitting, at their side of the table, and they can, move their movement points. I think stuff like that makes the game fun and is sort of a all-encompassing, aesthetically pleasing experience.
So Sawyer, to stay on top of the game design and the slide that you're on right now, I asked the question of, can you explain more about the event cards and the player cards? You have them by season, as we see on the screen. Can you talk more about that and the province cards and how you drew inspiration for those?
Absolutely. So the province cards, and I'm remiss to not have a photo of the opposite side, but essentially our province cards had the outline and the color of the province and the name and how much the province is worth. 200 gold each time you collect resources, or 300 gold, and the gold was in the little red bags there. But the province cards were pretty much based on Monopoly or a variety of other board games where when you own a province, you get your card and you claim ownership. If the province becomes contested, then nobody owns the card. If 2 people have 2 different strongholds, the strongholds are different colors for your different kingdoms, then no one owns it. Or if someone defeats you, then you just hand over the province card. The mission cards are the brown cards that you see just to the right of the province cards. Each player, got 3 at different levels, and they would turn them in once it was completed. And a mission card might say something like, you have to reach at least this amount of HP and capture this province, and this province. Once the game went on, like a level 3 mission objective card might say you have to kill someone else's general. So it gets more complicated, but as I touched on earlier, there was a reason for that, and we put a lot of thought into what we wanted those objectives to be. And then when you completed a mission objective card, you turn it in, you get a certain amount of hero points that you slide up the scale, you unlock new advantages, and you're one step closer to winning. You go the route of mission objectives rather than conquering half of China, which we found in playtesting most people want to do the mission objectives and not conquer China. Which is, I think, a valuable lesson because at this historical point in time, none of those warlords in this particular decade felt comfortable conquering China. They didn't have the resources for it, and it wasn't to their advantage to do so, which is why 3 kingdoms period, because there were 3 kingdoms. And then finally, the event cards. That was actually taken from gosh, Sebastian, you might have to help me out because my colleague Hannah was the one that came up with this idea. The Rising Sun, is that the name of the wargame that you introduced us to that has the season?
Yes, Hannah loved that game.
Hannah loved that game, and that was she was just really excited about the seasonal component of that game. And it made sense for us too because we were thinking, ancient China, like, hey, it's a lot harder to get your horses through the mud in the middle of winter. And that's going to affect you. And famine and drought and angry peasants, in this time period, it's hard to be a warlord if your people are angry at you and they're not willing to pay you taxes and they're burning down your stronghold because their child has died from plague. So the event cards allowed us to include those external elements. And they were representative of the season. Winter's going to be a lot worse for people freezing to death, starving to death, lots of death and terrible things in the winter. But there are also event cards that were positive. In the spring and the summer and the fall. But that's where those came in. And just to reiterate with the turn process, the way that the seasons work. So if the game comprises a decade of time, and in each year there's 4 seasons, and if one season card is drawn when everyone, which is 3 players, have gone once, then you have 40 all the way around the table turns before the game is over. And at that point, if no one has won, then you look at who has the most hero points, and that determines the winner of the game. So that's how we did it. We wanted to limit the game to a decade of time, although the 3 Kingdoms period was much larger than that in scope. And back to our scope and scale issue, it was really difficult for us to decide where in the massive period of time we really wanted to focus this game. And we chose this particular decade because it was right after the major battle of Red Cliff, where Cao Cao's amazing army was knocked down to size. The other 2 kingdoms had an alliance that broke off, and everyone pretty much packed up their armies and their balls and their toys and went to their corners. And so we wanted to allow them to be on that sort of even playing field, consolidate, and then see if people would form alliances and start to pick at each other's borders or go farther than that and conquer. And in some play tests, if you get a particularly aggressive personality, you would see a kingdom just go for it, full force. But the cards, I think, are really the mechanisms by which the game moves forward. The event cards make it interesting. They add all the necessary components to make the game fun. And the stratagems as well, the purple deck, I think is the only card deck I didn't talk about yet. Those you can buy, and you can have up to 7 at a time. And those allow you to do things like challenge your general to a one-on-one duel, quote unquote, and you both roll a die, and if you get above a certain number, then you kill their general. Or you capture them and you take them hostage, and the player whose general that was has to agree to some ransom that you set. You say, oh, I'll give you back your general if you give me this province and 500 gold. Up to you, but that's the kind of stuff that makes the game interesting and different every time, so that it could be played again and again.
So Sawyer, while we're on this slide, people wanted to know is how did you guys do the artwork? Was it farmed out? Was it handled by one of the design team? Did you use public domain? How'd you do this? I know you talked about it a little bit earlier. Can you talk more about it a little bit here?
Sure. And I have to give credit to my team member Evan, because he really was the one who did the map. The map was his baby. Hannah really focused on the cards, and I focused on the player screens, the abacuses, the strongholds, the meeples, the actual little army counters, and also the one component that I guess I haven't talked about are these sheets that look like PowerPoint slides that say like Kingdom of Shuhan and have all these different icons, and those sheets are they're just designed on PowerPoint, but they represent your hero, the 4 generals that you could have in play, and then on the far right side, the 5 garrison forces that you have allowed to you that just serve as extra defense for strongholds you think are important. And as you buy your armies of Lu, and again, each of one of those little counters is about 500 people, you get to place them. You assign them to your different heroes and generals that are in play, or your different garrison forces, and nobody can see how many forces you've assigned to each of those representative meeples that are on the map, but you, because it's behind your player screen, which increases the level of, what is the word I'm looking for? It's imperfect intelligence, right? And we thought that was important for this time period because of it being 200 CE China, and you don't really know how many people are in that army unless you have a great network of spies, or you see them come over the ridge line at the horizon, and then you're like, oh wow, that's a lot of people. So that's how we designed that. So most of the artwork was done on PowerPoint, but the map, the beautiful illustrations of the characters that are on the stickers that you can see on the abacus, a lot of the artwork that's in the rule book. Total War 3 Kingdoms is where we got those images, and that was just because it was available and we were students, and at the end of the day this was originally just an in-classroom academic for educational use only project. If we were to ever shop this around for production, of course that's copyrighted imagery, and we would have to work with a company to get that shopped out to designers or changed somehow. I am no amazing graphic artist. There's no way that I would have even dreamed of trying to make artwork this beautiful, especially within the period of an academic semester. But I think in terms of just having a prototype, it was good for us to use that database of images that already existed for this time period, and just so that we could, at the end of the day, this was a learning process for us. Not something that we started out with the intention of making a commercial product or the intention to sell. We just wanted to see how well we could design a game, and if we could make it beautiful on top of that, so that when we went to demo it at a place like Marine Corps University, that it wasn't, so that it was at least had some like value. But yeah, that's where we got the artwork.
So we have 2 questions that will finish up this session. One is sort of hitting your thesis, is what do you make of the tension between artisan and apprenticeship models and a call for academic formalization? The questioner asked because there are some graybeards in the community who are quite resistant to the idea that wargame design can or should be formalized. Yes, I think, and that was why you're hitting it on the head, that's why I wrote that thesis, because I was aware of that tension as well, and I just wanted to sort of question it. And if you're going to attend Connections this year, I'll actually be presenting my thesis in full at Connections. So if you want all the details, be at Connections. But no, I think that I don't personally think that the two need to be in conflict, and I agree with the graybeards, as you've so aptly called them, in saying that there is such a fantastic value to just designing a game and getting good at it by designing games and having a mentor if you can have them. But I think the truth of it too is that
you have to be really fortunate to get one of the great wargaming jobs where you have a mentor who's willing to teach you wargame design. Or you need to, on the side of your job, just, try to find people who are like-minded as you and try to design a game on the side. And that's awesome if you have the initiative to do that, but that can be intimidating if you don't know where to start. I think that formalizing the discipline can mean a lot of different things. For me, formalizing the discipline simply means having a consolidated place where there's literature. Maybe there's even like a wargaming academic journal so that we read each other's research and we have these kinds of discussions. And there are academic programs that recognize wargaming as a discipline. And a lot of that is rhetorical, but something that I think is very true to organizations and communities is that rhetoric is important. If you conduct an ethnographic study, you look at natural language, you look at how people talk about themselves. I think if the wargaming community, I don't think they have to let go of the guild identity because I think it's valuable, because wargaming is a craft and it is something that you become really good at. If you practice it over time, it becomes an art form for you, and I think that that's really valuable. But even a guild with a craft can have classes, and even a discipline with a craft like, I don't know, glass blowing can have literature about it. And it's not, you want to shy away from over standardizing something that is an art form, but there's also a lot of places where you can make subtle formalizations that add validity to the field. And something that I think is a really great source of inspiration that the wargaming community can look to is the artistic research community. The University of Oslo and a couple other leading institutions in the Baltic region and in Europe have been heading up artistic research programs within the last couple decades. And it's a very little known about field, but they're sort of in the same predicament as the wargaming community, where they say, hey, art is beautiful, but it's really hard to talk about it because it's something that's subjective, right? So how do you have people conduct, how do you have students engage with art? How do you have people talk objectively about art practices and standards of process within art? And should you even do that if it is an art? The answer is that I think you should, for the preservation of a discipline and for the benefit of people who want to join that field. And because if you can, and you can do it well without infringing on sort of the inherent character of the subject, it allows people to have deeper, more meaningful discussions. And I think that's sort of at the root of why academia is important. There are ways, and I encourage you if you have a chance to go to Connections and we have more time, if you would like to attend my actual full lecture on my thesis itself. I think that there's a lot of promise for formalizing without infringing on sort of the inherent character of what wargaming is. I'm not talking about changing the field. I'm just talking about adding some bones and highlighting some things that are already there, so that you can simply put what already exists in a new frame rather than adapt it into something new, if that makes sense.
That's fantastic, Sawyer. As we end this session, I want to ask you a two-pronged question of your course. What was one of the hardest challenges about the course, and what was one of your favorite memories of the course?
Well, I think the hardest part of the course was the TDXs that we had to do. Were really hard. Sebastian, you did a great job of challenging us to sort of get on a tactical level and think through sort of many war games and having to make decisions. And I found that really difficult because I'm more comfortable in the theory and the design space rather than the actual sort of the play space. So that was challenging. I think also challenging is, strangely, it can be challenging to be given absolute free reign in an academic setting, right? If you have if you have a set amount of time and you have deadlines in a project, it can be hard to liberate your brain space enough to step away from the demands and actually get creative. I think if you can find that mental space to do that, that's where the fun happens and that's where the innovation happens. But in a strenuous academic setting such as Georgetown University, that takes some willpower to do that. And I think, fun. Heck, for me, the whole class is fun because I was just so excited that I could even get academic credit for designing a war game. I think the whole process was fantastic. And there are some frustrations that come along with designing any game, right? Like the pressure of, you're going to the print shop and they misprinted like 20 of the cards and you've got to call them again. And the stress of that, the fun, I guess, bureaucratic roadblocks to design, the bumps along the way. But ultimately, I think just sitting down and designing a game is so fascinating. Being able to make the little decisions, I think the best part that I came across and why I fell in love with game design in general is that you get to take something that's incredibly complex and then shrink it down into a simplified model, but the process of consolidating it and shrinking it and finding mechanics that represent real life processes is so fascinating to me. And I think, I think we have as board game designers, maybe a set or tools of mechanics that we often draw upon, but I'm so excited at the idea that there are mechanics that haven't been invented or repurposed in all the ways possible yet. And that every time that you put a mix of different mechanics together, you can create some new model that hasn't even been thought of. And to me, that's the exciting part that I really got out of this class.
Thanks, Sawyer. You can tell the truth now that you're not in my class anymore. And we'll have more tactical decision games for you in the future. So those are
so hard.
I'll bring some to Connections virtually. We're going to end this session, and I just wanted to give a round of applause here and virtually for all the people who have been engaging and for your wonderful presentation and your wonderful game. And hopefully we'll see it out in somewhere in the future. And I put the link for Connections for those who want to follow up with Sawyer's presentation where she'll be presenting. And I have to run off soon because I am presenting my own now. Thank you, everyone, and this recording will be posted later on through Armchair's Dragoon, and thank you for our host, for Dragoons Assembly, for putting this all together on a wonderful Saturday morning. Thank you, everyone.
Everyone, bye.